I'm Lyndsey Smith with RealAgriculture, and joining me now is Kevin Good with CattleFax here in San Antonio, Texas for CattleCon. Fantastic CattleFax event. The big show for Thursday, of course, is the outlook, the grain and the beef outlook. Your thoughts on sort of, can we summarize this in a short word, because there seems a lot of things at play?
Sure. I think from a big picture standpoint, you just have to, supply side, I think is pretty simple. We've had 6 years of liquidation here in the States, and we feel like we're at the bottom of the trough. Cow slaughter is at a point where we're starting to expand just a tick, looking at that data on the beef cow side. Unfortunately, we're not keeping as many heifers back as we need to quite yet to turn the tide, but at least we're stabilizing the herd from that standpoint. So going forward in here, we would suggest our beef cow herd's pretty flat to slightly larger as a trend over the next 2 to 3 years, driven by record high calf values, obviously, but some of the headwinds we continue to face, as you all do as well, as we continue to see drier weather patterns, age of producer, cost and availability of labor. We look at interest rates, availability of capital, urban sprawl. There's just a lot of headwinds that offset the record high values.
So that, of course, is the supply side, which I think has been a big topic at this convention as well. But demand, very strong. So that of course creates some pricing opportunities, but further complicates things. Oh, absolutely, and that's the bright spot. If we looked at beef demand, really it's as stout as we've seen in 40 years. Just from a historical perspective, we lost a lot of demand in the 80s and 90s. Our product wasn't real great. It wasn't consistent. There was a war on fat. Everything worked against us. We turned the tide in 98, and really over the last 25 years, beef demand has been exceptional. One of the gauges that we look at is retail prices. They've gone up annually at 4.6% over the last 25 years. Contrast that to inflation going up 2.6%. So in reality, a lot more real dollars coming back into the cattle industry. In fact, it's kind of a tidbit, but that increase in demand, if we would have gone up with inflation instead of above inflation, the difference is about $800 a head for a fed steer or heifer. So it's huge. It's mammoth. Now, and that was part of the discussion, of course, this morning was the quality of the beef, the work that U.S. producers have done to really improve the quality of cattle moving through. It ends up making more value at the processor and to consumers. What do you think has driven some of that change?
Oh, going back and just look at the way we merchandise cattle, a big driver was grids and formulas. If you go back in the late 90s and before, the vast majority of cattle were sold one price fits all. And then as we started to put them on a rail, take the hide off of them, pay for quality, consistency, then as we saw some premiums develop, and we did, then obviously producers wanted to get those premiums. So we saw grade, choice and prime. If you go back, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that was about 55%. Today, it's 84%. So we've done a tremendous job of improving the quality of our cattle herd.
Now, we certainly have seen with that very strong demand, the U.S. consumes a lot of beef, also exports, but an importer as well. So can the U.S. supply all of its own beef?
If we just looked at it historically, in times like we're out where we've liquidated, we've got a smaller cow herd, the short answer is if we're going to keep per capita consumption where it is, no, we have to rely on the global markets. And obviously with our record high values, that's a draw, as you see as product coming in, not only from Canada, but also from Australia, South America. Our 90 trim price is record high, and so because of that, we get a lot of grinds, particularly from Australia and South America. Obviously, a lot of whole muscle cuts from Canada. That's going to continue.
Now, certainly the question of rebuilding that cow herd comes down to grass. We didn't hear the best news from Matt Makins. I asked him for good news. We did not get it. How concerned are ranchers with the grass situation?
Absolutely, and Matt's message this morning, I would just simplify it. He suggested we're still in the La Nina type pattern, which is a drier pattern. He would suggest that the moisture conditions will be a little less favorable than last year, but still more favorable than the 3 previous years, which were tough. Bigger picture, longer term, we're still in a macro, long-term drier pattern, so that's a big headwind. And obviously because of that, we're going to be much slower rebuilding this herd. And in theory, because of that, prices should stay higher longer.
So certainly, when we saw some of those numbers of good returns for producers, of course, which is a good thing, but the prices, of course, ration demand. So there was some talk, of course, of potentially seeing some of that demand pull back. What might that look like?
Well, if we go back to the last cattle cycle as a gauge, at some point the retailer will squeeze the packer margins, which we're doing. Packers will have to turn around and start to squeeze margin out of the system from the retailer. At some point, he's going to say, well, I got to keep my margin, so he's going to raise prices. And the last cycle, there was a series of months where we saw prices go up substantially, 20, 30, 40 cents a month for a series of months. That's what we're waiting for. At some point, that will occur. And that'll be the signal that we're getting closer to the end of the run, because obviously we're going into tighter supply the next 2 to 3 years. We have to ration that with higher prices. And we'll push, retailer will push prices until the consumer says no.
Now, we also have some trade volatility, of course. As we touched on, the U.S. brings in a lot of cattle, or beef, both, of course. How has the last few weeks of volatility, and we're smiling because we're sort of on the other side of at least the next 30 days, but of course this is likely set to continue. How is the cattle market dealing with that?
The first comment is uncertainties are negative to the markets because nobody knows exactly what will take place. So that's overlying comment. As we think about the trade balance between U.S., Canada, and Mexico, we realize that it's a two-way street. Yes, we bring a lot of live cattle in, particularly from Mexico, but also from Canada. It's interesting to note this last year, in particular, the end of last year, we sent a lot of feeder cattle from U.S. up to Canada. And if you just look at Canadian numbers, from BSE on, it's been a slow erosion. So to keep the infrastructure in Canada as far as feed yards and packing capacity, in theory, we'll send a few less south and bring a few more from the north, or from the south north, just to keep that in check. So it's unfortunate, but it is what it is. And I think when it's all said and done, the markets will sort it all out. We are getting feeder cattle back in from Mexico as we speak. We'll see how many we can get there. There's a couple more hoops we have to jump through to get those cattle across. And obviously we've got a 30-day reprieve, and we'll see what takes place at the end of that.
Now, is there, obviously, the carcass has changed on the animal, the quality has changed on the animal. Is there an ideal cow herd size, you think, for the U.S.?
Oh, that's in theory, if you're going to continue to see weights go up at about 0.7 of a pound, I'm just throwing some math out there, and that's what the long-term trend has been. Population grows at the same spot. If exports and imports are equal, year after year, in theory, you're kind of there. You don't need as many cows as you start climbing back from an expansion standpoint to produce the same amount of product. So if you look at the two different herds, you look at the beef, and we are in a 10, 11-year cycle. We've been for decades, actually a century, and each high is a little bit lower than the previous high from a number standpoint. Now, if you look at the dairy industry, it's a flat to slightly growing herd in the U.S. We continue to get more product out of the dairy industry. We think that trend will continue over time.
Certainly exciting times ahead, some uncertainty, but we'll get through it.
I appreciate it, Lyndsey. Best of luck.